Let me welcome you tonight to Harvard's John F. Kennedy School of Government and say a special word of welcome for your having come out on what is being celebrated otherwise by people as a Halloween evening, and which we can see how it may be relevant as the discussion continues. The topic tonight is a most important subject that's being investigated here at the school and important to the country, namely the future of America's policies concerning children and families. Despite 5 years of economic recovery, the poverty rate for children in the United States today is now 20%, and for black Americans, it is more than 45%. A related development is that more and more of our children live in single-parent families. Given how hard it is for one parent to be both the caretaker and the breadwinner, and particularly in the light of the low wages paid to women, it's not surprising that more than half of all poor children live in mothers-only families. What can government do to strengthen families, to reduce poverty among children, and to reduce the negative impact of poverty on children? Our speaker tonight, U.S. Representative George Miller, Chairman of the House Select Committee on Children, Youth, and Families, has been one of the leaders on these issues for many years. I'm delighted that he's agreed to be with us tonight to help map the future of public policy for children and families. And I'm especially pleased to welcome back tonight to the forum Professor William Julius Wilson. He will be responding to Congressman Miller's remarks and will be extending some of the comments which he made here in this forum last year in his extraordinarily powerful Godkin lectures on the underclass. Mary Jo Bain, who's the director of the Kennedy School Center for Health and Human Resources Policy, will formally introduce our panelists and will serve as moderator of tonight's discussion. So let me say welcome to Mary Jo Bain.
There was a fair amount of speculation upstairs as to whether I would actually dare to put on this hat in the forum, which I indeed wore in honor of Halloween for a good part of the afternoon. So, in honor of Halloween. We're especially delighted to have Congressman Miller and Professor Wilson with us this evening because they are members of the advisory board of the Center for Health and Human Resources Policy and were with us this afternoon in the first annual meeting of that board. They spent the afternoon listening to what we were about here at the Kennedy School and in the Center and responding to some of the things they were doing, and I'm delighted for their service in that regard, for the service of other people who are in the audience who are also serving on our board, and for their willingness even after that to come and be with us in the forum this evening on Halloween night to talk about issues related to children. Congressman George Miller is serving his 7th term in the United States House of Representatives as the congressman from the 7th District of California. We inquired of him this evening at dinner as to how strong his opposition was for re-election this year, and he assured us that he wouldn't be here if he wasn't reasonably sure, though of course one never takes these things for granted, that he will indeed be serving his 8th term. In 1983, Congressman Miller became the first chairman of the House Select Committee on Children, Youth, and Families. Its hearings have focused on such issues as the economic status of children and their families, child care, teen pregnancy, and the cost-effectiveness of preventive services. His numerous legislative achievements, which earned him the title of the leading spokesman for children on Capitol Hill, include the Adoption Assistance and Child Welfare Act, the Women's, Infants, and Children's Act, the Family Violence Prevention and Services Act, and the Asbestos School Hazard Detection and Control Act. His work on behalf of children and families has been honored by the National Committee for the Prevention of Child Abuse, the Daycare Council, and the California Child Development Council. Congressman Miller is a member of the Committee on the Budget and has been a member of the Education and Labor Committee throughout his tenure in Congress. He also serves on the Interior and Insular Affairs Committee, where he chairs the Subcommittee on Water and Power Resources. What he will be talking with us about tonight is the legislative agenda for children in the next administration. And clearly this is an important time for us to be thinking about that. Whoever wins the election next week will be faced with incredibly difficult issues relating to children in this country and with hard choices to be made. And whoever ends up controlling the House and the Senate will also be faced with these choices. So we're very privileged to have with us tonight Congressman George Miller to lay out his ideas on the legislative agenda for children. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mary Jo, for that introduction, and thank you for the invitation to come and to speak with the forum, and finally you honor me with my membership on the advisory committee for the Center of Health and Human Resources Policy. It's not that I'm overconfident that I'm here tonight. I just felt that given the tenor of the presidential campaign, that this would be the last place my right-wing opponent would look for me, and we shall find out. Although with Governor Dukakis's admission now of being a liberal, they may be around here again. But I am honored. I set out some years ago to see whether or not we could move the issues of children and families to the center of the national debate, and sure enough, there in the national televised debates between the candidates, George Bush actually said he was for the WIC program. Wait until he finds out what it stands for, and that it involves women's, infants, and children, and a lot of money. He will be alarmed. But we also have the candidates now going to child care centers instead of military bases. As a matter of fact, apparently military bases are not a good place to visit at this moment. But child care centers are, and we have the candidates going around and picking up children and trying to figure out which ones have the odor and which ones don't. But they're doing it, and that's all new for presidential candidates. And in that sense, I'm delighted about that. But I had obviously expected more. I had expected more in the way of a very real national debate, and had high hopes for the children's agenda in this presidential campaign. And part of that was based upon the early speeches and the platforms of the parties. And it appeared that the challenges confronting America's next generation were going to receive an unprecedented amount of thoughtful public discussion. Unfortunately, my optimism turned out to be somewhat misplaced. Once again, we learned that a campaign is a very poor place to raise difficult issues, because few politicians are willing to conduct that debate when an election hangs in the balance. It is regrettable that we have allowed this opportunity to pass, because in many ways there is a growing consensus, and certainly within the Congress, about the nature of the crisis that affects our children. 5 years ago, I had the idea that we could elevate the knowledge of the Congress about the condition of children through the creation of the Select Committee on Children and Families. And in the wake of the early Reagan assaults on the domestic budget, the House responded and created that Select Committee and named me the chairman. The committee is a non-legislative committee, authorized only to conduct investigations and to hold hearings, and to take comprehensive inventory of families and children in this country. Now, 5 years later, I must say that I'm very proud of the work that we have done. Because we did not represent a threat of legislative action, we were granted special license to investigate unexplored regions of public policy, and we have. Children with AIDS, youth gangs, teenage pregnancy, child poverty, children with long-term illnesses, and children in the custody of the state. And of course, we all know the kinds of tragic findings that the Select Committee has uncovered and reported to the Congress and to the public. 1 in 5 children growing up in poverty, twice that level if they're black. A quarter of all women going through their critical first month of pregnancy, never seeing a doctor. Millions of children deprived of the essential nutrition during gestation, with the tragic consequences in terms of birth defects, low birth weight, and infant mortality. Tens of thousands of young Americans whose basic social grouping is not the family, is not the school or sports team, but a youth gang that deals drugs and preys on our neighborhoods. 25% of all youngsters, more than half in the inner cities, dropping out of school dropping out before high school graduation, and a quarter of those who make it through unable to read at grade level. Just this week, two new reports have again documented not only these very disturbing conditions of millions of our children, but even the inferior condition of America's youth when compared to less affluent nations. More Americans live in poverty, according to the Urban Institute, than in 7 European countries, and not just Scandinavia, but the United Kingdom, Canada, and Australia. In some cases, our poverty rates are 2 and 3 times as high as those countries. Another new study by the Conference of Mayors found that the conditions in our cities have significantly worsened over the past 5 years, a victim of what I call governmental child neglect. The Reagan years have seen the emergence of the homelessness as a major phenomenon among families and children, first as an emergency, later as temporary, now as a permanent part of the American landscape. Our efforts to bring down the infant mortality rate have either plateaued or have slid backwards. Today we have infant mortality rates in some of our largest cities that exceed many of those in the third world. Fewer children are eligible for Medicaid, for nutrition programs, and for income support despite the need. And the much heralded safety net for America's children was shredded by the indiscriminate budget cuts in the early 1980s. But that didn't stop the administration and the Congress from throwing the children, especially poor children, out the window. Now it is true that we've been able to protect some of the most effective and most proven programs from the worst of the budget cuts. We insulated 12 of those programs from the automatic sequestration that is mandated by the Graham-Rudman law. And we even managed to eke out some small increases the last 2 years in what we called the Children's Initiative. But we can't be terribly proud of the record. Even the modest increases we have won in the WIC program, the Special Supplemental Food Program for women, infants, and children, leave more than half of the currently eligible children without access to the program. Even the protections that we have won for Head Start leave more than 80% of the eligible children unserved. And despite our fighting off efforts to reduce the Medicaid, the maternal and child health, neighborhood mental health programs, child immunization, these crucial programs are still missing millions of vulnerable children. Those children, as you so well know, aren't going to go away like a beggars whose pleas we ignore. Those children will become living monuments to indifference in an affluent society. At a time when we need the most productive, the best educated, and the best trained students and workers, we're falling further and further behind our international competitors. And the children who fall behind today will become an economic anchor chained to the leg of the American economy that simply will not be able to compete in a world economy for decades to come. I cannot help but look over the last 5 years at noting the irony of the existence of the select committees side by side with the steady, if gradual, abandonment of our commitment to children. Yet serious as these problems are, I do not believe that they represent the greatest challenge facing us. It is increasingly evident to me, both within the Congress and in general, that there is a great appreciation that we are failing to address the economic, the education, the medical and nutritional needs of a significant number of young Americans. That was not the case 8 years ago, and it was not the case 4 years ago. But today, with youth gangs and drugs and teen pregnancy and child abuse, adolescent AIDS on the front pages, and on TV movies, the public knows the problems are real and growing. And beyond question, the Congress also knows this. No, the challenge is not ignorance about what must be done. The problem is the unwillingness to act on the knowledge we already have. The challenge is not to educate Americans about the conditions of their children. It is to persuade the American people and their elected leaders to commit themselves to policies which are urgently needed but politically unpopular. For despite our consensus on the nature of the problem and our knowledge of the remedies, the fact is that the American political system is simply unwilling to enact those policies which are urgently needed. We are told that the remedial policies are too expensive, although the cost of not acting is undoubtedly greater. We are told that they would mandate a bigger bureaucracy or a more intrusive government. Whatever the excuses, the conclusions seem inescapable. that our political system as presently operating is not capable to meet the crises. And the price of that failure to act is being paid by the victims who fall further into poverty, further into dependency, and further into despair. And of course, the ultimate cost is ours as a society. It is this discrepancy between the consensus for that dramatic action is needed and the unwillingness to make the commitment, which should be the top priority of strategists, policy planners, and politicians in the months to come. We cannot simply spend the next 4 years merely documenting how much further behind we have fallen. First and foremost, we must find a way of communicating the urgency of the challenge to the American people. And that means that we must devise a way to change the prevailing political attitude on government spending. If every effort to assist children is rejected on the basis of cost alone, then we will fail, and so will our children. As the Committee on Economic Development, a coalition of corporate leaders has concluded, any plan for the major improvement in the development and the education of disadvantaged children that does not recognize the need for additional resources is doomed to failure. And yet the leaders of corporate America, while they admit it, and they admit that the price of action may seem high, but the cost of inaction is even higher, we still have not been able to form a consensus in the nation. If the Congress is willing to consider a multi-billion-dollar tax loss to encourage capital development in this nation, how do we convince them to embrace a similar initiative to invest in our human capital? If the Congress will approve billions of dollars to rehabilitating our infrastructure, how much will it invest in rehabilitating our undereducated, untrained, and unsocialized youth? If government and voters continue to be guided solely by the twin axioms of deficit reduction and tax reduction, how do we stimulate new policies for children? These challenges, far more than documenting the need or reaffirming our past successes, present the greatest challenge to policy analysts and politicians alike. A nation grown comfortable with fiscal fantasy must be wrenched into facing reality. I do not pretend to come with the answers tonight, but I do know that we must aim our attention at the electors, not the elected, for if there is to be a change in national policy, it must first win the endorsement of the mass of voters and the taxpayers who have been content with inaction. If we fail to encourage this transition, I fear many ways for what this country can become. What kind of America will we have with 20 million unproductive, unsocialized, untrained Americans, which we can easily produce by the year 2000? What kind of America with an avalanche of drugs and drug-related crimes and growing public anger about our ability to staunch the violence? What kind of America with income groups growing further apart, with tens of millions raised in poverty, with fragmented families the norm and not the exception? If after a wasted generation and a lost opportunity of the last decade, the next administration is allowed to continue on as the last has, then surely we will lose the ability to steer the course of success for millions of American families and tens of millions of their children. It is the intent of the Select Committee not to let this happen. We are prepared and committed to move to the next level of battle, to see that after the conventions, after the debates, after the sound bites, the platforms, and even the election, that fundamental policy changes follow this political season. It will not be sufficient that politicians and policymakers recognize that children are our most valuable resource. It is important that this recognition not be allowed to be a substitute for action. This effort will require greater risk by all of us in this room. We can no longer be content to prove our case. We must be willing to struggle to see that our labors bear fruit for those that we care about most. And this means that America must be made to confront the cost of continued failure to act. They must be made to understand that they are being lied to when they're told that America can continue to thrive while so many are doing so poorly. America must be made to understand that they're being lied to when they're told that we can continue to become rich and strong at the expense of the poor, for surely the poor have very little left to transfer to either the rich or to the Pentagon. And Americans must be made to understand that they're being lied to if they believe that America can survive continued and even growing racism. Racism that segregates our cities and our jobs, becomes an excuse for a lack of social action, and a continued barrier to both social and economic justice. Americans cannot allow our prejudice, to strip the disadvantaged and struggling families of their value and their dignity. We must recognize that so many of those who live at the margins in America, amid all of the chaos, very often exhibit resolve and strength and values that are greater than we expect even from ourselves. Should we lose these families, we will lose the transmitters of our social and cultural values to a vast segment of our society and the keepers of our most fundamental institution in America. At the same time, we risk the creation of another generation that has the ability to dramatically lower the American horizon. No national catastrophe need occur for these horrifying scenarios to emerge. All that need happen is that for the current trends to continue, unabated by policy actions that have been too long deferred. And we in this room can play a critical role in devising the alternatives and the options, not just for saving children, because we know how to do that, but for moving the political system and the electorate to act. Thank you very much.
Thank you. If Congressman Miller is one of the most prominent political spokesmen for children in the Congress, Professor William Julius Wilson is one of the most prominent academic analysts of the problems of children, especially those relating to minorities and those in the inner city. Professor Wilson is the Lucy Flower Distinguished Service Professor of Sociology and Public Service at the University of Chicago. He is the author of a number of books and articles based on his own research, including The Truly Disadvantaged, The Inner City, the Underclass, and Public Policy, his most recent book. As Dean Allison said, we were privileged to have Professor Wilson with us last spring as the Gotkin Lecturer here at the Kennedy School of Government, and we're delighted to welcome him back this evening as a member of the Advisory Board of the Center for Health and Human Resources Policy and as a responder tonight to help us carry on the dialogue about the legislative agenda for children. Professor Wilson.
Thank you very much, Mary Jo. Congressman Miller's presentation tonight outlined some of the developments in recent years that I have been particularly concerned about, such as the incredible increase in the number of working people in poverty since 1979. The many Americans, including children, from working families who have no health insurance protection of any kind. The high number of children born to mothers who did not have a prenatal visit during the critical months of pregnancy. All of these things have occurred in recent years. The sharp growth in the number of poor children during the past decade, especially poor black and Hispanic kids. The precipitous drop in the median income of young families and of poor families with children since 1979. And the rapid rise of families with children in the homeless population in the last few years. I believe that the problem, when I think about these depressing developments, I believe that the problem of the worsening condition of the more disadvantaged segments of our population can perhaps be best captured by looking at changes in the poorest of the poor category, the poorest of the poor. For example, the number of children in families falling below half of the poverty line reached 5.4 million in 1987, an increase of 1.4 million since 1980, and 2.2 million since 1978. It's even worse for black families. The number of black families falling in the poorest of the poor category has increased 69% since 1978, from 1 of every 3 poor blacks to nearly half, 45%, in 1987, in the poorest of the poor category. Now these worsening conditions among the more disadvantaged segments of our population in recent years, and I'm talking about within the last decade, have occurred also during a period of sharp reductions in programs targeted to families with low incomes. And I'm indebted to a really excellent report recently released by Robert Greenstein, director of the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities. I'm proud to be a member of the board of that very important center. Greenstein, in a recent report entitled Still Far from the Dream, pointed out that total appropriations for low-income programs that are not entitlements. What are we talking about? Various job training programs, health and social service programs, housing programs, fell 54% from fiscal year 1981 to fiscal year 1988, after adjustment for inflation. 54%. Entitlement programs, such as the food stamps program, that portion of AFDC for working poor families, and the unemployment insurance programs were also cut significantly. For example, in 1987, he points out, just 31.5% of all the unemployed received unemployment insurance benefits in an average year. 31.5% of all the unemployed. This represented the lowest rate on record. For blacks, it's even lower. Only 1 in 5 unemployed blacks, about 21%, received unemployment insurance in an average month last year. He also points out that whereas in 1977 there were 78 children receiving AFDC for every 78 poor children receiving AFDC for every 100 children in poverty. In 1987 there were only 58 children receiving AFDC for every 100 children in poverty. Now, during this period of sharp budget cuts for low-income programs, the income gap between the haves and the have-nots has widened. Indeed, in 1986-87, the poorest 2/5 of all American families received the smallest share of the national family income since the Census Bureau began collecting these figures in 1947. And it's significant to note that the richest 2/5 received the largest share of family income since 1947. Now, this growing gap between the advantaged and disadvantaged segments of our population is even reflected among minorities. For example, take the black population. Whereas the average income of the poorest fifth of the black population declined 24%, dropped 24% from 1978 to 1987 after adjustment for inflation. The income of the richest one-fifth of the black population increased by more than $3,000, and that of the top 5% by more than $9,000 after adjustment for inflation. Now, that these income discrepancies have grown among both black and white families is, I believe, a reflection of the strength of the current public support for programs that, in the final analysis, are geared to enhancing the lives of the advantaged at the expense of the disadvantaged. Indeed, in no period in my adult life has there been a greater de-emphasis on the social rights of citizenship, and more tacit and open support for the belief that it is not the inequities in the larger society, but the poor themselves who are largely responsible for their social and economic predicament. I'm reminded of T.H. Marshall's classic thesis on the development of citizenship in the Western world. Namely, that the more a society recognizes or acknowledges the organic link between poverty and the economic, class, and racial structure of society, the more the emphasis on the rights of citizens will tend to go beyond civil and political rights to include social rights. That is, and I quote from Marshall's classic thesis, the whole range from the right to a modicum of economic and welfare security to the right to share to the full in the social heritage and to live the life of a civilized human being according to the standards prevailing in the society, unquote. As Marshall observed, a society that emphasizes the social rights of citizenship will tend to believe that it is important for the welfare state to generate a condition of equal social worth. That is, the existence of a minimal level of resources available to all citizens of the society and sufficient to enable them to become full members of the community and to experience what the society has come to perceive as an acceptable or a decent standard of living. The realization of the principle of equal social worth, as J. Donald Moon has recently argued, requires that the state adopt a set of institutional principles that govern the policies of the welfare state, including macro management of the economy in pursuit of full employment, the universal provision of certain social services, and a comprehensive social insurance program. These institutional principles have been developed differently in different political settings in the Western world. But in general, they do not carry a stigma, and they therefore enable people to exercise the social rights of citizenship and to live more or less according to what the respective societies perceive to be an acceptable or decent standard of living, while maintaining their self-respect. When I think about some of these Western European democracies, for example, and I would even throw Canada in there, and compare their commitment to the social rights of citizens to that of the United States, I think about what can be done in this country to place more public emphasis on the social rights of citizenship and to address some of the concerns outlined by Congressman Miller, and indeed thereby halt the growing gap between the haves and the have-nots, improve the life chances of the more disadvantaged among us. Well, first of all, I think that it is necessary to recognize that despite the fact that a majority of Americans are likely to endorse individualistic explanations of poverty and welfare, explanations that deny the social origins and social significance of poverty and welfare. Nonetheless, evidence from public opinion polls clearly show that Americans are prepared to endorse general programs that promote, not undermine, the social rights of citizenship. For example, in another paper that Congressman Miller prepared, he points out that 73% of the respondents to a recent national public opinion poll expressed a willingness to have taxes increased to pay for child care. 3/4 of the population said they'd be willing to pay increased taxes to support child care. Not child care for minorities, not child care for the poor, but child care for Americans. And what I am trying to suggest, as I think about some of these public opinion polls, is that it is extremely important to recognize that there would be little enthusiasm today for programs of social reform of the kind that progressive congressmen like Congressman Miller would support. There would be little support for programs of social reform among the general public if they are discussed as solely benefiting the truly disadvantaged. In other words, if the issues are couched in terms of promoting economic security for all Americans, if the essential political message underscores the need for economic and social reform that benefits all groups in society, not just poor minorities, a basis for generating a broad-based political coalition to achieve such a reform would be possible. I really believe that. Indeed, on the basis of a review of national public opinion polls, I am convinced that programs that guarantee jobs, reform public education, assure child support, provide child care and health care, and expand the earned income tax credit would draw strong support from the American public if they are not narrowly targeted to the truly disadvantaged. The point to be emphasized, however, is that we would be able to improve the life chances of groups such as the inner city poor with programs in which more advantaged groups of all races and class backgrounds could positively relate. So I would like to see political leaders talk about important social programs that would enhance the social rights of individuals and discuss them in such a way that the white ethnic workers on Chicago's west side could relate to them, as well as the black inner city workers. That's what I mean when I talk about the need for effective political leadership to address some of these issues. We can talk all we want about the current political atmosphere, but I remain convinced that if we couch our discussion of these programs in terms that capture the imagination of the broadest segments of the population, we have a basis for achieving some reform. Now, I think that Congressman Miller would agree with this argument that even though the cost of programs to expand social and economic opportunity will be great, we have to weigh these costs against the economic and social costs of a do-nothing policy. Thank you.
Let me invite both comments and questions from the floor. There is a microphone on either side here. Is there also one up in the balcony? I can't tell. You guys may have to come down. So let me invite people to come to the microphone. Since I'm the chair, I will take the prerogative of the chair and ask the first question. It seems to me, Congressman Miller, that while concern about children can be, and indeed is, in many cases, a nonpartisan issue, conclusions about what to do about it are not nonpartisan. And indeed, the presentation that you gave tonight, as we would expect, was not a nonpartisan presentation on what to do. And it seems to me there are legitimate differences of opinion and perception about what government is and is not able to do with regard to the problems of children. I wonder if you could think aloud a little bit for us, kind of thinking about the politics in the Congress and the politics as you see it in the country, as to where there's some agreement across parties about approaches to solutions and where the issues really lie.
Well, I would think first that the major accomplishment during the last decade, I guess, and with the help of an awful lot of people from this school and people around the country, is arriving at a bipartisan consensus, if you will, as to the need. I mean, I think it's very clear now that if as President Reagan did, he said he thought that Head Start was Ron and Nancy's favorite program, and yet he sort of undermined it by cutting Title 20 funds and nutrition funds. In the Congress, in fact, it was stopped because there's a consensus about Head Start because people believe that it works, it's effective, and it's cost beneficial. The same is true of the Women's, Infants, and Children's program. Bob Dole is one of the major supporters and kept the administration from cutting that program. I think what I was trying to say is we've come over that hurdle, and we've proved it time and again. Every politician will say you save $3 for every dollar you invest in maternal and child health or WIC or prenatal care or what have you. But what they won't do is they won't put up the $5 billion to get the return. You haven't arrived at a consensus yet about making that investment. We much admire, I think politicians much admire people who are venture capitalists who are out there in the free market system, the capitalist system, making it. We don't have the courage of the venture capitalists. We're not willing to make that decision. Now, within that consensus, you obviously are going to get discussions on the periphery about what is government's role. And I think Julius is correct that what we really need is a national child care policy. That doesn't mean a federally run program. That means a policy that says we're going to promote and try to reconcile the stress within a family between work and home, so that people, their economic livelihood and a healthy family are consistent with one another. With health care, you know, as long as we continue to segregate health care, I guess it's going to continue to be expensive, and people are going to be left out, and some people are going to get upset about it. But that's really the decision. And when we now are arguing between Michael Dukakis and George Bush whether it's going to be a tax credit for people or a tax deduction for people who need child care, or whether there's going to be federal grants to low-income people, that's relatively minor. Where the places that I think we're balking, even the 73% of the people who say that they'd raise their taxes, don't let them vote on it. Don't let them vote on it quite yet. Because I think it's a question of exactly what they believe they're getting. And I just think that there is a hurdle that where this administration has been very effective, that it's evil to raise taxes and it's evil to spend money. And you can't answer these problems. You can't answer these problems without money. It's just that simple. This administration wrote into office saying you can't solve these problems by throwing money at it. You can't solve them without money. We've done all of the cutting. We've done all the paring back. We've weeded people out. We've made programs more expensive. The fact of the matter is these programs are resource poor. And I think that's going to be the test of the next administration. We know the agenda. You know the agenda. Everybody in this room knows the agenda. It's not courageous. It's not bold. It just happens to be terribly effective. But we need about $35 billion over 5 years period of time to see if we can get maybe half or three-quarters of the currently eligible children into these programs so they can benefit. But I'm not sure that the political courage in the current debate is there, or that the remnants of this election will allow that to take place.
Let me follow up on that just for a minute while other people are coming to the. Okay, go ahead, Bill.
I thought you were telling me to wait there.
No, I wasn't.
First thing I should tell you is I bet Mary Jo $20 she wouldn't wear the hat. I owe her $20. I'm struck by this analogy to venture capitalists and the answer that you just gave, and in fact was intrigued by the connection with the capital gains tax reductions. And if you think about what that's doing for us, it is making us bold and courageous in some areas. And in fact, what I'm a little worried about from the story I've heard tonight, that it is very much an eat your broccoli story, and the only thing I've been asked for, as near as I can tell so far, is my money. And that isn't very appealing. When people get around to vote for it, it doesn't sell very well. I was wondering, have you given any thought to how to make the program courageous and bold and attractive? And what I'm thinking about I've talked to a number of people who have adopted a class in the ghettos in New York City. And when you talk to them, they're going to sponsor them and so forth. And they tell me that these are generally people who are quite wealthy, but they'll tell you that the money's not the important part. That the part that really matters in making those programs work is spending time with the classes, meeting with them on a regular basis, worrying about their problems, and getting involved directly. And that kind of participation by the people who are helping there seems to be making it interesting and in some sense bold and exciting for them to be involved in it, independent of the money that they're contributing to that process. And it seems if you're going to make progress on this agenda, you have to somehow go and ask the American people to get involved in ways that are exciting and interesting for them, and don't just ask for the money, even if you think the money's necessary. Have you given some thought as to how to package that agenda and get people more involved?
Well, at one time, I'll go back to the notion that we were going to try to involve people in the VISTA program, Volunteers in Service to America. We were going to take young people from the universities and graduates and put them to work in the community, and they were going to create sweat equity along with the people in the community. Of course, the minute they started organizing senior citizens against utility rate increases, the federal government pulled the plug, because they weren't there really to empower poor people. They were there to help them pick up their yard. I guess my problem is it's not terribly exciting. I mean, I appreciate that Mr. Lang went and adopted a class. And I think that's exciting because to me the message is for the young person that the prize is going to be there when they're all done working, as opposed to a lot of marginal families that think maybe somebody will get shot or the father will get unemployed. Even if they can get into this place, they can't afford it. He's telling them, you do it right, the prize is guaranteed. But we're not doing that. And I don't know, how to make it have sex appeal or political appeal or whatever the term is you want to do. I mean, dealing with poor women and with pregnancy in crummy communities, in lousy environments, I guess is very rewarding, but it's not very appealing. And that's what we have to do. I mean, that's where the problem is. I agree we should try to make the programs acceptable to middle America as we possibly can, and they need many of these benefits, and it lets them share this experience. But again, it's sort of blocking and tackling. I mean, it's very fundamental now about feeding people during pregnancy, about seeing a doctor in your first 3 months, about following that person through, about getting the kid into some kind of full developmental program early on. We could obviously use a great deal of help, but we've spent a decade telling people that they ought not to be doing that. They ought to take care of themselves. Are you better off than you were 8 years ago? Not are we better off, because the answer to that question is not so good. But if you can keep asking it in the singular, then I suspect America will keep reacting the way that it is. This is so fundamental to the health of millions of kids that I'm not quite sure how I dress it up. I thought the goal was to make sure that policymakers knew, damn it, when they went back and they told their constituents they were spending a buck, they were getting a buck's worth of service. And that's what it was all about, because we were fighting waste, fraud, and abuse, not dead children, not miscarriages. We were fighting waste, fraud, and abuse. That was, I thought, the goal, and then we'd be all willing to do it. We really want to help those people if I just knew I was getting my tax money's worth. You and a lot of other people have proven that case. You're getting your tax money's worth, but you're only doing it for 20% of the eligible kids.
Bill, will you speak to that one too, and especially to one of the broad issues that I think Bill was raising in his question about, okay, there are some things that we can agree that government can do, perhaps, like provide prenatal care and so on, but to what extent are those things that we know government can do genuinely speaking to the problems of the truly disadvantaged?
What things do we know that government can do genuinely speaking? Mm-hmm. That would... But
I guess my question is partly that when we talk about what government can do and we talk about providing prenatal care and a few other things about which people agree, it seems hard to disagree that those are good things to do. But it seems to me we ought to go beyond that somehow and think about whether those are really the crucial things, the things that are going to make a huge difference.
Well, first of all, when we look at figures that show that the infant mortality rate in certain ghetto communities reach figures that are 6 times as high as the national infant mortality rate, certainly prenatal care is very important. What I'm trying to argue is that you could talk about basic programs that would enhance the life chances of inner city residents living in the most impoverished sections of the community, with programs that are discussed in terms, general terms, universal terms, programs that are sort of designed to make sure that any American is not going to receive inadequate health care or inadequate public education. You could talk about prenatal care. You could talk about reforming public education, not inner city school education, but reforming public education. And you could talk about, look, we're not competing with the Japanese, we're not competing with the Russians, our kids are falling behind in school, our reading scores are down. You don't have to talk about the reading scores of inner city youngsters. You talk about the reading scores of people in public schools. Our public schools are inadequate, we're no longer competing. And if we're able to develop programs that would improve our public schools, obviously inner city kids would benefit. Jobs. We talk about the need for jobs, a guaranteed jobs program, programs that put America back to work. Any sort of program that achieves that goal will obviously benefit inner city residents. So what I'm saying is that there are certain fundamental programs that you could couch in sort of general universal language that would capture the imagination of that white working class ethnic male on Chicago's west side, because he says, yeah, I'm concerned about public education. I'm concerned about employment. I'm concerned about prenatal care, health care. I'm concerned about child care. That's what I'm saying, because I recognize that a good deal of the support for the dominant American belief system that poverty in the final analysis can be reduced to individual shortcomings is based on a kind of racist notion that blacks are in a position they're in, minorities are in a position they're in because of their shortcomings. People tend to associate poverty with blacks and with minorities, and so I'm trying to sort of move away from that, recognizing the current climate of opinion, and still achieve progressive reform. Once we reach the state in our society where people are willing to define poverty in structural terms, then maybe I think we can talk more explicitly about programs that are targeted to the truly disadvantaged.
Let me just, if I might say, I think where you run into a problem politically, and I absolutely agree, I think if you said we want a national program that all children read at grade level, the country would support that without concern of whether the child is suburban, urban, black, or white. Where you run into a problem is then when you get to the cost factor in the Congress, they say, well, we're back to the truly needy. Well, the fact of the matter is we have a national interest in all children reading at grade level, whether they're truly needy or they're truly affluent. That's the national effort. And when you get into the cost, the kind of slop over that we had in accelerated depreciation, where we created the city of Houston with no tenants, that slop over was perfectly acceptable. The Real Estate Association thought it was great. Merrill Lynch thought it was great. The waste that was created in hundreds of billions of dollars of assets. But we won't allow it to slop over from the truly needy to the marginally needy, to the only needy, to the affluent needy. We won't let it move that way within the social structure. We'll let it move that way in the Highway Act, in the Pentagon, in the Tax Act. You can slop it all over. But if you get one more person than the truly needy, somehow you've missed your calling in terms of being a responsible member of Congress. That's not a plea for waste. It's a recognition that these problems run throughout our society. I come from an affluent, conservative, suburban district, and there's nobody reading at grade level there. You know, we could share that national program that Bill's pointing out. That's a common goal. Well Baby, a national program, a Well Baby program is a common goal. We got 40,000 babies that die every year, many of which are essentially preventable, easily preventable, rather cheaply preventable. But we don't frame it in that terms because, as I tried to say in my opening remarks, we are now caught between no tax increases and no spending. Well, hell, you know, that's not the United States of America. That doesn't recognize the complexities. And I think that Bill's right. It's just when you fold that one inside on Capitol Hill, you need a spinal transplant for the Congress to respond to it. And that's not covered under most of our health care programs. And you can't get any out of the House or the Senate. Oops.
Will you introduce yourself before you ask your question?
My name is Monica Faith Stewart. I'm a student in the mid-career program here. I was intrigued by Professor Wilson's focus on working class blue-collar workers on the southwest side of Chicago. And I thought that this is, in fact, the voter you described is the Reagan Democrat, that swing vote in the middle, the one that both candidates have been campaigning or pandering to or appealing to. And I would think that the real issue here is one of leadership. I would disagree with the congressman, respectfully so, that we need to aim attention at the electors and rather than the elected. I think that we have a real hole in public leadership. I think that public leadership has resorted to appealing to the lowest and meanest of our common denominators, and it does require a special kind of vision and courage to call all of us to a greater ideal. I mean, the prospect of wrapping ourselves in a flag that has huge holes of indifference and ignorance and dying babies, that cannot be the kind of America that blue-collar types like to think about while swilling beer. And I don't think that, then this kind of vote has been characterized as, I kind of am fond of the ignorant Yahoo vote, but I think that's unkind and, represents my own kind of bias. And so I'm intrigued by the notion. I think that it is not altogether, we've had our little running debate, it's not altogether a sellout to say we have to couch these in terms that everyone recognizes his or her self-interest. And I'd like to hear more discussion of that, not really the particulars of a program, but isn't it a real call for leadership? And here at the Kennedy School, I think that should be our focus.
Monica's running for office. You want to respond to that, Congressman? Or Bill?
I was participating in a forum organized by Life magazine before Jesse Jackson decided to run for office. And I remember having a conversation with former head of the Urban League, who was almost assassinated, was Vernon Jordan. He said that there's no way that Jesse Jackson's going to get more than 1 or 2% of the white vote. I said, don't be surprised, because I had some idea then. This was during the summer of 1987. I had some idea that Jackson was going to fashion his campaign in such a way that he would be able to capture the imagination of a lot of people that blacks would have ordinarily written off as racist, because Jackson spoke in terms that they could relate. He talked about issues that they're very, very concerned about, and he was able to talk about them in a way that people forgot about him as a black person and started thinking about him as a political leader. Now just think that if Jesse Jackson didn't carry all of that baggage around, where he's associated with Farrakhan and his previous history, and he's black. Just think we had a white leader with that kind of political leadership. But just think if Dukakis, for example, had really said, look, he's now, and I'm glad he's now saying that he's a liberal.
He's fessed up to being a liberal.
Yeah, right. But if he had just really pushed the idea of the rich tradition of liberalism and saying, look, I'm concerned about the racial divisions in our society. Say the same thing in a white community that he says in a black community. So you know why we have racial divisions? Because people are talking about things that split people. Let's talk about things that unite people. You know what unites blacks and whites? Delivery of social services, health care, jobs. And I think people would relate to that. And he can underline that and emphasize that. And that's where the importance of political leadership, I think, comes to play. And it's very, very difficult to get current leaders to recognize that. I don't know why. Maybe Congressman Miller can comment on it.
Well, I think because, to be polite, we're a fairly pragmatic group of people. And when you look in your home district, in every state in the union, with obviously exceptions, my hometown being one very recently, but when you see the denial of tax increases for school time and time and time again, in my district, traffic is the #1 issue on every public opinion poll, and they've turned down any efforts to increase local sales tax or gasoline tax or any effort at all to improve the highways, where they're living on the highways for 3 hours a day. They won't improve. I mean, in our hometown, we finally got the tax package passed for schools because the kids went out and kind of, grabbed their parents by the nape of the neck and said, my school, it's falling down. But for 8 years, they had turned it down. So the graphic example to a politician, in the entire sense of that word, good and bad, is it's not there. It's simply not there. And I think that one of the reasons it's not there is that America doesn't fully understand how great this burden can turn out to be for this society. They have lost some historical memory about what happens when you take away too many people's food and too many people's education and too many people's housing. That's the makings of social backlash. And you get no argument from me on leadership on any level you want. But I think what has happened is that each time the electorate has had to belly up to the bar, more than often they've said, even when it's in my self-interest, no. And for a lot of we're still recovering from Prop 13 in California, or 2.5-year measure. That was the last big gong of the bell on taxes. And it's been replicated over and over again in school districts and all kinds of special districts. And I think that at some point, but then when you have the two presidential candidates go read my lips or flexible freeze and all this crap that they go through, all knowing that they've got a commission working telling them how to raise taxes. I mean, the Congress reacts, and politicians react to what's on the ground, to information on the ground. I've read poll after poll that says to me almost essentially for every purpose of public spending, people will vote to raise their taxes. It just doesn't bear fruit. We just raised taxes this year. You didn't hear Dukakis or Bush, the president, sign the bill. We just raised people's taxes this year. But politically, it's not there, and that's why I think you got to go to the electorates and say you're paying a huge price for their inaction.
Let me move on to some other people. Thanks, Monica. Carol, were you in line? You going to butt in front of a baby?
Well, no.
I saw you in line.
All right, well, having no choice here. I just wanted to ask some more questions on the child care issue. For obvious reasons. I think in terms of what Professor Wilson was saying, it certainly is something that has wide appeal to people of many different classes and in many situations. But I wanted to get both of your thoughts on how you do make it an issue that people are willing to pay for. I think our local example, the Kennedy School, doesn't have a daycare center. It's the only Harvard professional school, probably because people aren't willing to pay for it. Nationally, you mentioned the school districts and not being able to get funding for school districts. If we can't get it for school districts, it must be that much harder to get it for an additional service, which is child care for preschool children. So I guess I'd like your ideas on how both locally and nationally we convince people that it's worth paying for.
Could I just, that's a good question. I'd like to put a question to Congressman Miller. Take your pass and pass it on to Congressman Miller, asking him this question. How is it that we can get Americans to continue to support the military budget? I mean, they're willing to pay an incredible amount of money. And surely they see it in terms of their vested interests. Couldn't they see child care in terms of vested interest? And maybe not in the same way, but I mean, doesn't the same principle operate somehow? You talk about political leadership. We've had incredible political leadership in getting people to support the military budget.
That's the railings of a lot of members of Congress, myself included. Because of world wars and because of Cold Wars and because of demagoguery, people buy that budget. Now, we saw that when Ronald Reagan came to office, 68% of the people thought we weren't spending enough, and as he's leaving, about 65% of the people think we're spending too much. So something's happening in that vein, and I suspect most of it has to do with Pentagon scandals and $600 toilet seats and so forth. But we've obviously pointed out that dichotomy, that one is an enemy from without and one's an enemy from within. If that child you're holding isn't the most productive child in the history of this country, my Social Security is down the tubes. I mean, we just put it point blank. I think finally that message is starting to come through, that we share as a nation. We should share for our economic livelihood the concern of that child. I think the case, again, I'll go back to, I think the case on the merits is, except for some extreme case in the Congress, has been made on child care. I mean, I think we've pointed out that child care is a tool which public policy people can use to get people off of welfare, to get them educated, to get them into jobs, for respite, for handicapped families, for long-term illnesses, all those kinds of things. It makes sense. But we're not prepared to belly up for the expenditure. And if you talk to people that never thought they were going to be there, they will concede the argument. They will concede that it's necessary in the district. When the Select Committee held its first hearings on child care, I didn't go to the Bronx, I didn't go to Manhattan, I went to Irving, Texas, to a brand new community. I forget the name, it's gone bankrupt since then, but to a brand new suburban community outside of Dallas, where there were all new families and all new houses, and the issue was child care, mainly Republican. And to show Republicans on the committee, this issue is now in the suburbs. And that's the point of my remarks. We have made the case. The Congress understands it. But for whatever reasons, they are so intimidated on the tax and spend issue that they will not then make the leap to action. And I think that requires some political action in the precincts, if you will, on these issues. They do not feel threatened. They feel very threatened if they vote against the stealth, or they vote against ICBMs, or the B1. Either they feel threatened because of the economy of California, or Connecticut, or Texas, or Missouri, or they feel threatened because someone's going to say you're soft on communism. Vote against that child? Who's going to say what? You're just for responsible spending. And that's why I said, it's not enough that we say, oh, our most valuable asset. That now becomes an excuse. It's a code word to say, I share that with you. I understand where you're coming from. Yes, I just don't ask me if I'm going to vote for money. Yes, I'm all for child care. Yes, our most valuable assets, future of this country. I mean, I don't know.
Okay, my name is Irma Rodriguez, and I'm a first-year student here at the Kennedy School from California. And one of the things that's been troubling me about my education here is that I feel we've been learning how to manipulate the system, how to learn how it works so we can change it around and get our goals through. And you've sort of already answered my question, so I'm going to ask it in a different way. What advice would you give to those of us who will one day take your place in public policy in the
Whereabouts in California?
What district are you from?
Lagos-Racino's district. But okay. But what kind of advice would you give to those of us who would probably be in similar positions as yours in a few years from now, if we want to sell a program that really seeks to serve the disadvantaged? I mean, it seems to me that by selling a program that really serves the disadvantaged, by trying to sell it to all of America, that it really only marginally helps the disadvantaged, and really, how much does it really help? And I wonder, what hope do I have of ever one day really making some realistic change and really affecting people's lives? That's a question that, I hear these talks, and I wonder to myself, is the Kennedy School reality to me? I go home and there's reality to me there. But what can I realistically do? What kind of advice would you give to someone who's going on in leadership?
Let me say, I don't want to be misunderstood. I still see the need for targeted programs. I still see the need for race-specific programs like affirmative action. I see the need for manpower training and education programs and so on, until we eliminate the vast discrepancy between the haves and have-nots. We're going to have to support such programs. What I'm saying, however, is that if you're going to have a political leader with vision and charismatic figure is able to really get people to support programs of the kind that we're talking about tonight, he's going to have to include more than just these group-specific programs. He's going to have to, the package is going to have to appeal to the vast majority of Americans. And that's why I say that when you talk about such programs, you put up front things that are going to get the broad-based political support you need, like child care, like a jobs program, like reforming public education, and so on. I'm not saying that realistically that a package would include all of these things, but obviously we have to begin somewhere, and we have to start talking about introducing certain specific programs of reform. I am convinced that if we continue to only talk about reform for the most programs for the most disadvantaged segments, we're not going to get off dead center. That's what I'm saying. And, you know, Congressman Miller is, I'm very impressed with him. He's one of the most progressive, enlightened congressmen in Washington. But I must say that I'm a little bit distressed by your cynicism, and I think it's probably the reality of your situation. I am just not convinced that the public will not respond to effective, strong leadership on some of these issues. And I think that what you're seeing over the past few years is a lack of forceful leadership, a kind of timid approach, that congressmen are unwilling to sort of put their necks on the line, you see, and therefore assume that the public will not respond. I'm not so sure that's the case. I was rather impressed with the way the public responded to programs of civil rights to eliminate racial discrimination during the mid-1960s. There was a lot of fear that Americans would resist a comprehensive civil rights program. But there was strong, forceful leadership there. Johnson did assume some leadership, and he did convince a lot of Americans. Of course, he got a lot of help from Martin Luther King and others. But there was political leadership there, and we were able to pass a very comprehensive civil rights bill. Sometimes I think we lose sight of that, and we might take more of a historical perspective on some of these issues.
Last question?
You don't get any disagreement with me on what Dr. Wilson has just said. You know, I go to home at night and I cry about the lack of leadership in my own party, in everybody's party. But you know, when I was in your situation, we thought a revolution was possible. And whether it was in the student movement or the war in Vietnam or social movement, or civil rights movement, what have you. And I guess I've learned that this country is more inclined to be incremental. That does not mean that I'm no longer a revolutionary. But I tell you what you need, you know, I mean, for me, you know, this isn't cynicism. I felt I ought to come here and tell you where I think we are. We've hit a bump in the road in terms of the public. But for me, and my concern about kids, one of your colleagues asked me riding in from the airport, how do you do this? I said, you get up every morning like you're killing snakes. I mean, I can't wait to go to work and kick somebody's ass. Now, I'm not going to get every kid on WIC, but if I can get 50,000 more, I can get 5,000 more, I can get some kid in St. Louis on it, I'm there. I'm like the firehouse dog, just ring the bell. But I think that's kind of how you do it. And then hopefully, you know, we will have people that will see that after 8 years of trying to, sorry for the people who had dinner with me tonight, but after 8 years of trying to, as Jesse Jackson say, imitate the Republicans and argue between Gephardt and Dukakis and Gore and Simon whether they were going to manage Reaganomics, they will find out that what the party needed was an imagination. And what the party needed was to speak to. I watched Jesse Jackson talk to 10,000 hard hats in my district. And he spoke right to them. He spoke to their wives. He spoke to the kids. He talked right to them. I'm not sure they were going to vote for him, but they'd vote for the issues. And so, you know, I don't know how you're going to change the world, but if you walk away from this discussion saying, oh, there's nothing left to do, it's hopeless, that's not what it's about at all. It's about, you know, it's about playing real hard-nosed football. It's about being in there, and it's kind of a yard in a cloud of dust, as they used to say. Because, I always look at Congress and public policy like this. It's just, I'm with the guys on the horses with the guns. And public policy is a stagecoach. And the only issue is, we're going to take off the watches or the whole strong box. Every now and then, you only get the watches, and you got to go to work tomorrow. Let me just tell you, you're not hearing cynicism here. You're hearing a guy who thinks he has the greatest job in the world. Christ.
And don't you try to get it. This has to be the last question.
All right, I'm Carol Gilligan. My question really is about who you're going to speak to in trying to make these changes. Because as you analyze the problem, Congressman Miller, you analyze the problem as one that largely involves women who are the single-parent heads of these families who are in difficulty, the mothers of these children whom you're concerned about. And as I've listened to you and Professor Wilson tonight, you've talked about the issue of race, you've talked about the issue of social class. No one has talked about this as a problem which largely involves women, and women are at least half, if not a majority, of the electorate of this country. I wonder if you could address this question.
Well, I'm trying to think. You know, when I started the notion of the select committee, well, even worse, I can remember when I had a bill on domestic violence, and to try to provide, I think, $2 or $3 million to do a study of spousal abuse. And I can remember people saying in the cloakroom, "You're going to take the fun out of marriage," members of Congress. It's an interesting notion. And I can remember when I started the select committee of people saying, "You're making a big mistake. You know, people on AFDC aren't going to contribute to your campaign. And what are you going to do? What are you going to do? Lactating mothers aren't going to help you." When the WIC program was up. And but the fact of the matter is, it is about women's issues. It is about half of the workforce, or whatever percentage of the workforce, and more than half of the population, and our kids, and the caregivers. That's America, and that's kind of where it's at. And I think that at some point, again, there's been some recession in the bill, in the feeling that if you vote against women, you're going to pay a price. With the evaporation of the gender gap for the second general presidential election in a row, suggests that if you stand up and you say you're for daycare, it means you are, and therefore you can beat somebody down that is in this state created daycare, created with respect to welfare reform and job opportunities and all. You can beat down that record by just saying I'm for it. So you have to say, well, wait a minute. I thought if you put in the effort and you built the record and you did the hard work, these people would reward you. The evidence suggests that that may not be the case. Now, we don't know quite yet where the women are going to vote and which women are going to vote where in terms of these issues, but I suspect that there's a strong notion in my profession that maybe 6-8 years ago this was a problem. It may not be as big a political liability right now as it once was if you vote against some of these issues. So again, I go back to my thesis in the beginning. I think it's time for renewed political action about these issues among women, or among families, or among single parents, whatever the constituency is, about the national agenda that Dr. Wilson, that this is what we need in this country. But right now, I don't think there's any sense that people, they care in the polls, but there's no sense that they care politically in terms of action, in terms of politics in the best sense of the word, that you could get your ass kicked if you double-cross them. I don't think there's any sense that that's going on there. It goes on certainly with the Pentagon. It goes on with maybe nuclear power, although that's obviously changed. But I mean, the big boys can always figure out how to fix you, the savings and loans, or the banks, or somebody. But right now, in terms of these people's issues or family issues, I'm not sure it's there. We know it's important.
The real challenge, it seems to me, for a political leader is to be able to define the issues in such a way that people concerned about racial stratification can relate to them, people concerned about class stratification can relate to them, people concerned about gender stratification can relate to them, without giving the impression that you're focusing more on one issue than the other. It seems to me when you talk about child care, you talk about child support, you talk about full employment, things of this sort, there's no reason why you can't address the concerns of women as well. And I think it's very, very important, however, not to lose those white males out there. It's no accident, that historical accident, that an overwhelming majority of white males are voting Republican because they think that the Democrats are not concerned about them. Women are split between Bush and Dukakis. Blacks are overwhelmingly for the Democrats. At one point, women were overwhelmingly for Dukakis. White males have been a solid group for Bush and the Republicans. A lot of the conservative Democrats are white males because they feel Nobody's addressed their issue. A lot of these people, a lot of the concerns of these people could be addressed by programs that are designed to alleviate class differences, or to alleviate some of the suffering associated with class stratification in the United States. So if a political leader could sort of articulate the issues in ways that different segments of the population can identify with, that person is going to capture the kind of broad constituency that I think you need to effect change.
Thank you. Congressman Miller.
Let me just say, you know, women made a very bad bargain with the Democratic Party this year. When we set out to start to write the platform, and I was doing the family economics and families, I said, is there a section on women's issues? Or somebody else working on these issues, somebody else in the Congress at the preliminary stages? And there was an agreement that there wouldn't be any section on, quote, women's issues, that we would tuck them all in the general platform so that they wouldn't stand out as recognizable issues and to be a lightning rod. That's with women's political leadership's assent within the party.
Congressman Miller, Professor Wilson, let me express my personal thanks and the thanks of the Kennedy School for being with us this evening with these provocative and interesting remarks. Let me thank all of you for being with us this evening on Halloween. This is traditionally the witching hour for programs in the forum, so thank you and good night.